Hello, my name is Dale Becker. I'm the Tribal Wildlife Program Manager for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. Today I'm going to speak to you about the Tribal Wildlife Program, give you an overview of what we do here in the reservation and in the surrounding areas where we work. It'll come as no surprise that wildlife has always been a very important resource for tribal people, any part of the world you're in. Here in this part of the world, of course, in more recent times, tribal people moved to the east of the Rocky Mountains to hunt bison and hunted a number of other species and used a number of other species resources for subsistence in their daily lives throughout the rest of the year. So if we look around the country, we see all kinds of wildlife representation of in the rock art that people left from earlier times. We see things like bison, bighorn sheep, deer, elk, owls, birds, cranes, snakes, just about every species that was out there in the landscape shows up in these written records that are chiseled in stone around the country. So when we think about traditional uses of wildlife, these are the things that were important, and we can use this illustration down in the lower right-hand corner as a good example from a bison that was taken, say, in eastern Montana somewhere. Certainly the meat was used for subsistence. Leather was used for clothing, moccasins. The skins stitched together used for housing. Horns and stomachs were used for tools and various materials. And of course other parts were used for cultural uses, and certainly there are spiritual significance to this animal, and it played a very important role in the lives of tribal people. In 1855, the U.S. government negotiated the Treaty of the Hellgate with the tribes to create what is now the Flathead Indian Reservation as their permanent homeland. There are a number of other treaties scattered across several tribal reservations across the Pacific Northwest. The important thing for our topic today is the Hellgate Treaty language that talks about the exclusive right of taking fish in all the streams running through or bordering the reservation as further secured to said Indians, as also the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places, together with the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries. And subsequent court decisions have reinforced that language, so that the tribes have a shared right to hunt in usual and unaccustomed places and have authorities for fish and wildlife management on their reservations. Basically, that area is western to central Montana for the sake of the discussion here. So when we talk about wildlife management today, we need to step back a few years and think in terms of more contemporary wildlife management here. Back as early as the 1920s, the tribes requested wildlife refuges, which later became Pablo and Nine Pipe wildlife refuges, because they were concerned about overhunting and overharvest of migratory birds in those two reservoirs. In the 1930s, they established an elk refuge in the southwestern part of the reservation and began to establish game conservation laws. In the 1940s, hunting was closed to big game hunting of big game was closed to non-members. and the tribes requested some initial biological studies of species that they had concerns about. In the 1970s and 80s, Bureau of Indian Affairs biologists conducted many wildlife inventory management actions. And since 1990 to the present, our program, the Tribal Wildlife Management Program, has been involved with a full range of wildlife and habitat management issues and concerns. So just a word or two about our program. It was created in 1988 when the tribes contracted wildlife management responsibilities on the reservation from the BIA. There are basically two primary components. The first deals with general wildlife management activities, and the third is related to SKQ dam mitigation. Our staff includes 4 wildlife biologists 2s with master's level degrees, 3 wildlife biologists 1s with undergraduate degrees, 2 wildlife biologist trainees, 1 habitat restoration specialist, and 2 seasonal wildlife technicians. Our mission statement basically is the protection, enhancement, and management of terrestrial wildlife species and habitats to provide for viable populations of all wildlife species on the Flathead Reservation for use by the generations of today and tomorrow. I often use this slide because I think it says so much. It was developed by the British Columbia Ministry of the Environment, and it fits well with our standard thought of what we do. Basically, every species is important and has a role as an integral part of the whole ecosystem. If we pluck one of those species out, there's a hole in that ecosystem, and a function of the ecosystem, or maybe many functions, have been altered on up through the food web and through the rest of the components in the system. So the reservation environment that we work in is a fascinating place to work as a wildlife biologist. To start with, it's large, 1.34 million acres. Some of the issues we deal with are multiple landowners, state, federal, tribal lands, private lands, and there's a diversity of habitat from arid sagebrush prairie type habitat up to alpine meadows, and the whole abundant variety of wildlife resources that inhabit all of those habitats. There are abundant populations of most species here. There's also a clash of culture, and that while wildlife biologists would rather not work with that kind of issue, it bleeds into our everyday work, and we work with a number of issues related to that. Along with that, there are jurisdictional issues between tribal, state, federal, and local governments. Tribal population here is a minority in number to non-member population. Different people have different values. There are a lot of land issues, land use issues, fish and wildlife management issues, and water rights, which is an ongoing discussion and process currently. But in looking at the reservation, in this map, we take a lot of pride in that there are a wide variety of conservation areas here in the reservation. And those include state, federal, tribal lands, as well as a lot of conservation lands that may be smaller in size, but they're also important. There are conservation actions that private landowners take. Some of the bigger ones are illustrated in pink, the tribal wilderness area, Mission Mountains Tribal Wilderness area, including the Grizzly Bear Conservation Area, which is shown in yellow, the Ferry Basin Elk Conservation Area, which is shown in green, light green, the National Bison Range, shown in purple, and a number of state properties shown in green around the Nine Pipe and Kicking Horse area, reservoir areas. So in general, our program includes quite a number of overall activities. We deal with wildlife population inventory and monitoring, conflict management between people and wildlife, reviews and analysis of environmental concerns related to projects, wildlife issues on ceded Aboriginal lands off the reservation, wildlife mitigation for SKQ Dam, including habitat acquisition, restoration, and monitoring, native wildlife species restoration, wildlife and habitat research, environmental education, and management of the program and developing our staff and maintaining their high level of expertise and credentials. So in the area of population inventory and monitoring, we're interested in all species, from things as small and seemingly as insignificant as salamanders, through migratory birds, bats, big game species, and grizzly bears. And we actively monitor and inventory populations of most, if not all, of those species. We're game managers. Tribal members, as I mentioned earlier, subsist heavily on taking game each fall. And so big game is a very important species. We also manage and regulate hunting for migratory birds, migratory waterfowl, and non-migratory upland birds. In the area of population management and monitoring, we spend a significant amount of staff time and a fair chunk of our budget on monitoring grizzly bear populations, because grizzly bears are one of the very important species from a cultural, religious, and an ecological standpoint. So we have a number of ongoing activities related to constantly trying to better understand grizzly bears and how they're doing in this environment. These are some of the data that we've generated from telemetry projects related to several grizzly bears. And if you're in the area, you live here, you know where Ronan is on the slide to the right, the image to the right. And you see grizzly bear activity along the mission front and in some cases out in the valley. And then you see some of the home ranges that are generated on the map to the left from those species. And it gives you an idea that the bears aren't always in the mountains. Quite often during the summer, most of the females that we're aware of and that we've monitored and their cubs spend most of the summer down in the valley and along the mission front. One of the other things we do is try to get as good a monitoring as we can on grizzly bear productivity, either from aerial surveys, which give us ideas like this about particular animals, or the telemetry work and follow-up visual observations on the ground. Some of the management activities we do, this is an area north of St. Ignatius, and what we were dealing with a few years ago with quite a lot of conflicts between bears and people and ranches. So we worked on a number of projects. We had a conservation easement that was held on one property. We did a number of conflict management activities, such as electric fencing and bear detection sensors, wildlife cameras, things like that. We did some habitat restoration in a riparian area, and another project on an aspen seep, which is a seepy area dominated by aspen trees. And then we did another purchase of another property simply to prevent the proposed subdivision that would have had potential for decreasing the quality of grizzly bear habitat. Plus, it would have increased substantially the potential for conflicts between residents there and grizzly bears. So when we talk about conflict management, just to give you a little better idea of what's involved, we deal a lot with garbage. Bears love garbage. They love to get into it because there's food stuff there. That's the attractant. So both black bears and grizzly bears get into garbage. We have a number of calls every year about that. We've done quite an investment in developing with a private corporation in Arizona a pretty good bear-resistant garbage can design, and we've had an active program where we do cost share with and do grant searches for funds to purchase the cans that are bear resistant and make them available so that we lessen that conflict potential. On some small farms, small animals are certainly bear food and attract bears. Things like pigs, sheep, goats, and especially chickens and poultry. And so in situations like that, we work a lot with the landowner and with some private funding sources to help cost share electric fencing or other designs to minimize their potential for conflicts. When we do have a conflict, we go out and spend quite a bit of time working with the landowner, determine to the best we can exactly what the cause of the conflict is. And in the case of grizzly bears, wolves, and now mountain lions, we're often able to get them some compensation for their loss. Over the years, we've also worked with area beekeepers to develop good designs for electric fences, which when used properly and maintained well, prevent grizzly bear damage on beehives and the loss to the beekeeper. We work quite a bit with other landowners to try to get hunters out to put pressure on animals, big game animals that may be causing damage to their hay crops. And then, of course, when we can, we often capture and move grizzly bears and some other predators that may be involved in conflicts. With environmental review, as I mentioned, we deal with a whole variety of projects, mostly land uses. They may be timber sales or modification of forest lands, forest management practices, or livestock grazing, construction projects, and just the ever-present subdivision that we're seeing constantly rapidly increasing in the area here, and the impacts that it may have on wildlife and habitat. I mentioned hydroelectric mitigation planning, which is a major component of our program. It deals primarily with SKQ Dam. It's governed by our approved plan under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which includes two components. One is a habitat acquisition restoration plan where we replace habitat that was impacted by the dam and its ongoing operations. The other part is an implementation strategy for fish and wildlife, which basically is our working plan on how we monitor wildlife on those lands, monitor habitat, and helps us to work on the direction that we'll work to achieve our goals. So in stepping back and looking at the mitigation for SKQ Dam, our mitigation goals, as I alluded to earlier, we're acquiring habitat to offset losses, enhancing and restoring those habitats, either by acquiring them or off-site non-dedicated habitats and restoration. Restoring native species, which were once common but are no longer here. And then the annual wildlife inventory and monitoring that I talked about. And then also habitat monitoring and management as needed. So with habitat acquisition, restoration planning, we've acquired approximately 15,000 acres. 1,792 of that is wetland, mostly credited from the Varial Zone between high water and low water and Flathead Lake. But another 985 acres of wetland habitat in the Varial Zone on the lower Flathead River below the dam. And another 312 acres of riparian habitat that's above the high water mark on the lower Flathead. Some of the enhancement projects that we are involved with are reducing noxious weed covers. Everyone here who manages land has noxious weeds and works on those. We restore riparian habitats, those green stream areas along rivers and streams and around the lake. Increasing cover deciduous trees and shrubs in some areas where it's appropriate. Increasing wetland acres and restoring the function of those wetlands. Increasing cover, persistent emergence. Increasing nesting cover in upland areas nearby. Restoring native grasslands in those areas. And restoring low to medium shrub components in those areas where it's appropriate. So if we look at some restoration projects we've done for habitat, wetlands primarily, the two slides on the left-hand side of your screen, which are pre-project slides, basically involve wetlands that had been drained in the past, mostly for agricultural uses. We acquired those lands and then basically restored the wetlands, put the water back into them with control structures that allow us to manipulate and manage water levels and control flooding below those. And so you see the difference in the amount of wetland habitat between pre-project and post-project in those two areas. This is another large wetland restoration project west of Dixon. It involves an old oxbow, the Flathead River, that was originally cut off from the river by the construction of the railroad. A lot of the features were still there. It was still a wet area, and so we did some modification and some control structures to maintain the wetland water that comes into it, and created this large wetland, which has been a real major habitat use area for migratory waterfowl and a lot of other species. A lot of the acquired lands that I mentioned earlier, one of our primary activities is restoring native plants. Some of those, as I mentioned, had serious weed problems, and we worked on those. And then basically converted the plant cover on the sites to native plants, which are more hardy and more able to resist noxious weed encroachments than some of the introduced grassland plants. We also have a number of wildlife habitat reference sites that we monitor periodically. Those involve bird counts, waterfowl pair counts and brood surveys annually, periodic small mammal surveys, and amphibian surveys. We also do monitoring of wetlands and grasslands. We take regular habitat health assessment data to give us a gauge of how we're doing. We look at the percent plant cover and what we may need to do to fine-tune management there. And then once again, noxious weed management is always an activity that we're involved with every year. One of the exciting parts of the project, the program we've been able to work with, is actually restoring species that were once fairly common here, but are now gone for one reason or another. The first one we worked on was with restoring peregrine falcons, which are the species up in the upper right-hand corner. That was a project done back in the 1990s. We then moved to trumpeter swans, which many of you see as you drive down Highway 93. And we now have a viable population of trumpeter swans here in the reservation, as well as to the north of us and starting to the south of us off the reservation. Down in the lower left-hand corner, northern leopard frogs were once a very common species here and are somewhere east, some places east of the Rocky Mountains. So we've restored that species by bringing back egg masses from similar genetic populations to the east of the Rockies and establishing them at 2 sites here in the reservation. Another species that's out in the future that we hope to work on is return of sharp-tailed grouse, which again up until about the mid-1970s were a common species here. There's a lot of cultural interest in that because some of the traditional dances by tribal people are based on Columbian sharp-tailed grouse dancing in the spring. A few years ago, we embarked on an elk migration project to look at where our elk go in the winter or through other seasons. We know some of them stay put right here in their home ranges. Others wander, and we had several females that went as far north as nearly 80 or 100 miles to spend their summer and have calves and then migrate to the back to the northern part of the reservation for the winter. We've looked at common loon migration. Loons are a rare species here in Montana and one that we have some concerns about. So we captured birds on Flathead Lake and put radio implants in them where the radio goes inside the bird. The antenna extends out the back. And these are, the map on the right illustrates movements of 4 of those birds going clear down, in some cases, to the tip of Baja California and then heading back north in the spring again. We've also done quite a bit of work on conserving native bats because they, again, are a part of the ecosystem here, but they're also humongous consumers of insects, that some of which are annoying to us people. And we've done quite a bit of work in trying to dispel some of the rumors and concerns that aren't always quite accurate about bats. One of the things we also did is look at bat hibernacula, or hibernating areas, or bat night roosting areas that can be safety hazards for people, but they can also be safety hazards if people go into them for bats because they can cause disturbance at a bad time and bats don't survive. So we've done some projects to actually gate some of those old unsafe, usually mine shafts and caves, so that we do a good job of bat management, but at the same time do some safety enhancement for people. We've worked a lot with the reconstruction of Highway 93 over the last 20 years, and that work continues. We developed a unique memorandum of agreement with Montana Department of Transportation and Federal Highways that tried to build a better highway that lays better and fits better on the landscape. A lot of that's involved wildlife crossings, one of which you're probably familiar with in the Evero area. The others, of which are about 41 of, you probably don't know they're there. You don't see them. And with those, we've done wildlife fencing to try to make wildlife use the crossings rather than come up on the road where they'd be hit by cars. And we've monitored those afterwards, looking at what uses them. A lot of deer species do. Black bears use them pretty regularly. Grizzly bears are more hesitant, and elk are a little more hesitant, but a lot of those structures aren't where elk tend to cross anyway. And a number of smaller species that you wouldn't think would be going through structures like that, but we've documented them. So during a 6-year project that ended in 2016, we worked with Western Transportation Institute to look at structures to see what actually is using them. White-tailed deer were as I mentioned earlier, were the big users of the structures, and so hopefully we've substantially reduced the number of accidents that might have occurred with these structures, and we're continuing to try to refine designs and sharing those designs with people from really all over the world. We spend a lot of time working with students, which is one thing we love to do because kids are fun to work with. That's why all of you folks are in education, and it's fun to share information with these little folks and watch them soak it up and receive the questions that they come back to us with. So to do our jobs, we rely on a whole wide variety of good partnerships with other management agencies, state and federal agencies, various other tribes, universities, conservation groups, and trying to blend in as much as we can and partner up with them on funding or projects to try to do as much as we can for the resource and the people who enjoy the resource. So with that, that's my presentation. I believe we have an opportunity for you to provide questions, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.